Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another Ask Ian Q&A on Forgotten Weapons. I'm Ian McCollum, and our question today comes from Nathaniel on Patreon. Nathaniel asks, why didn't Germany or the Axis powers in World War II have a machine gun similar to the American M2? Well, there's actually quite a lot to unpack in order to properly answer that question. So let's start with a little bit of background on the M2 itself. This is a machine gun that was developed at the very end of World War I by John Browning. It was essentially just a scaled up version of his model 1917 30 caliber machine gun, originally water cooled. And it was intended to be an anti-aircraft and anti-tank multi-purpose super machine gun, basically. And at this time, modern tanks at the end of World War I were vulnerable to simple 50 caliber AP bullets. Today, we have to have far more high-tech munitions to defeat tank armor. Back then, tank armor wasn't that much. A 30 caliber rifle round was probably not going to do anything, but a 50 caliber round could, especially if you fired a whole bunch of them. And it wasn't just the United States that saw the potential in this, the Germans did as well. And at the very end of World War I, one of the things that Germany was developing was the 13.2 millimeter Tank und Flieger machine gun, which was essentially a Maxim gun, scaled up just like Browning did, but scaled up to a 13.2 millimeter cartridge. Just for comparison, 50 caliber is 12.7 millimeters, so this is on the order of 55 caliber. The TUF machine gun would never see service. Only a couple of prototypes were built, but it did get into, they did take the cartridge and build the Mauser Tankgewehr around it. And it's that cartridge that would serve as the basis for pretty much all of the other 50 caliber developments, including the American 50 caliber, as the cartridge was developed and ultimately adopted. Now, with the end of World War I, there had been a presumptive order for 10,000 of these Browning 50 caliber machine guns. That was canceled with the end of the war, and the only reason that the American 50 cal survived was because in 1921 the Coastal Artillery Service decided that it liked the water-cooled 50 caliber machine gun as an anti-aircraft weapon and formally adopted it. That was really the one thing that kept this weapon in the US military inventory system. Now, Colt owned the rights to manufacture the gun, and they would try to market it and sell it during the interwar years, and it wasn't really very popular. They sold some. The most important thing was that in the 1930s, they developed a universal receiver for the 50 caliber machine gun that would allow it to be very economically manufactured. One standard receiver that could be built up as either a water-cooled emplaced gun, as an air-cooled heavy-barreled flexible mount or turret mount or tank-mounted weapon, or as a wing-mounted remote-fired aircraft gun. And this allowed Colt to actually continue manufacturing the gun in a reasonably efficient manner. Had they not made that innovation to it, the gun may have been dropped from Colt's production before we even get to World War II, because it just wouldn't have been very cost-effective to be manufacturing it in the small quantities that it was actually being purchased. Now, when we get to World War II, other branches of the service do see potential for the 50 caliber machine gun. In particular, it is an aircraft gun and an anti-aircraft gun. That's really the main reason that this thing exists. The idea of an infantry anti-ground target heavy machine gun, that's a thing, but it's really not the primary purpose. Now, there were other guns around the world that were developed and were adopted in a very similar structure to the M2, although most of the others were actually magazine-fed. Probably the most common of them is the Hotchkiss Model 1930, which was it was a magazine-fed 13.2 millimeter heavy machine gun, and it was adopted and used by a bunch of countries, including the Italians and the Japanese, as well as the Poles used it, and a number of other small countries that weren't huge players in World War II. But you did have 50 caliber machine guns on the Axis side, as well as on the Allied side outside of the United States. The British had a 50 caliber Vickers gun, a couple different versions of it actually, but none of these were put into all that much service. There is a debate going on at this time, and before World War II, and after as well, as to what's the most effective sort of aircraft or anti-aircraft weapon, and there are a bunch of different schools of thought. One of them is that a 50 caliber machine gun is the trade-off is that 50 caliber doesn't offer you enough volume in a projectile for an exploding fuse, for an exploding projectile. With 50 caliber, you're pretty much limited to, at best, incendiary, or maybe just armor piercing. But those both require you to actually hit the target in order to do anything to it. Once you expand up to about 20 millimeter, now there's enough space in the projectile to have a fuse and an explosive charge, and you can damage an aircraft without having to actually hit it. You can just get close to it, have the projectile burst, and damage the aircraft. And so this is a big part of the debate in different countries over what's the best thing to use as an anti-aircraft weapon. The US, once we get to World War II, because we do have the M2 in production, it's, we understand how to make it, it is in service with the military, the ammunition is in service. We don't have a really common, say, 20 millimeter gun at that time, the way we do with the Browning M2. And that contributes to the M2 being chosen as the United States answer to this question. A lot of it is logistics. In other countries, in a lot of other countries, you'll see preference for 20 millimeter guns, or even larger, especially as World War II progresses. People start looking at 37 or 40 millimeter guns for anti-aircraft use. The aircraft in World War II are getting more and more heavily armored. Now, one of the other countries that did actually develop a belt-fed 50 caliber heavy machine gun was the Soviet Union. They developed they turned the Degtyarev into a 50 cal gun, the DSHK, adopted in 1938. And they would use it for much the same role as the M2 was intended to be used. However, one of the big differences, and one of the other reasons that the M2, I think, is so well known today, so recognized, and seems to be ubiquitous, is ubiquitous, is during World War II, the US kind of did a massive industrial flex on the rest of the world with the M2. It's a bit memey, but you could think of this as like the classic Uncle Sam painting with glowing red eyes of fire, because the US manufactured about 2 million Browning 50 caliber machine guns. About 460,000 of those were Browning M2 heavy barrels. And that's the classic version that we think of, that you see bolted to every vehicle in American inventory in World War II. We had 8 different companies manufacturing these things. To put that in perspective, by the beginning of 1944, the Soviet Union had manufactured about 8,400 DSHKs. We made 460,000 of just the heavy-barreled air-cooled iteration of the Browning 50. It's an insane number of guns, and the US doctrine was, we're basically going to put them on anything that can hold them. We're going to put them on trucks, we're going to put them on tanks, we'll put them on some Jeeps, we'll put them on half-tracks. We'll put 4 of them together in a big mountain, put that on a half-track or on a trailer. It's like Oprah just handing out 50 cal machine guns to everyone who could conceivably use them. And that's why you see the M2 everywhere, and you don't see a lot of these other 50 caliber guns that were in existence. Now, you will see the Soviet Union sort of adopt this after World War II, when they the US figured for anti-aircraft use on tanks, we'll throw a 50 cal on every single one of them. We've got 30 caliber machine guns in the bow, perhaps, or coaxial with the main gun, and that's for anti-infantry use on the ground. And then for anti-aircraft use, each individual tank has a 50 cal machine gun on the turret. The Soviets would do that after the war with Dishkas, throwing them on all of their tanks, which is, if you look at Soviet tanks after the war, you'll see that. Some during the war. I'm not a huge tank historian. Now, the Germans, to try and loop back here to the original question, why didn't the Germans have a 50 cal machine gun? Well, the Germans kind of went with the 20 millimeter thing. The Tank und Flieger development was dropped largely because of restrictions from the Treaty of Versailles. By the time German armament restarts in the 1930s, they made a choice to go with a larger caliber, and they don't bother to really develop a 50 caliber. They've got a 30, which is the MG42, or the MG34 at the beginning of the war, and then they'll develop some 50s. Now, we don't see, or they'll develop some 20 millimeter stuff. Now, we don't see 20 millimeters on the top of German tanks. And so I thought, rather than try and bumble around it myself, I'd go to someone who has a better base understanding of, say, tank air defense combined arms doctrine. And so I reached out to Nick Moran, the chieftain, to ask him what was German anti-aircraft strategy or doctrine during World War II. So Nick was kind enough to help out with an answer. So Nick, take it away. What was the German thing?
Well, Ian, it turns out that you've come up with quite an intriguing question, and one to which I have no answer either. So, as you do, I asked around a bit, and it turned out that also neither Hilary Doyle, who is basically the final word on German armour, nor the director of the German Army's Panzer Museum, Rolf Ratz, has the specific answer either. However, from what they've told me, we can make some inferences. To start with, you are quite correct about skipping over the large machine gun calibers in Germany, and this applies not only to anti-aircraft work. At the time when the US Army was fitting caliber 50 machine guns into turrets of M1 combat cars, M1 armored cars and M2 light tanks as the primary weapon of its armored vehicles, the Germans were putting a 2cm cannon into the turrets of Panzer II, 2316 wheels and 222 recon cars. That both nations would use their same caliber when it came to pointing guns upwards would make some sense. When talking about German air defense, it's worth noting that two different organizations were responsible for this. There was the General Luftwaffe flak units, which went up to the level of a flak corps, and were responsible for air defense in general, particularly of bridges, logistics centers, and anything else of operational importance. However, at the unit level, air defense was primarily the responsibility of the Heeresflak. Generally speaking, these were 1 battalion per division. These could contain weapons as big as 8.8 centimeters, but more normally we're talking half-track mounted automatic guns, 3.7 centimeter single barrels or 2 centimeters singles or quads. Compared to heavy machine guns, such as mounted on the M16 half-track with its quad 50s, the cannons could provide a larger area of coverage per vehicle. Quite simply, you can shoot further with a cannon than you can with a machine gun. It's worth noting that American divisions tended to have an anti-aircraft artillery battalion attached as well, but they were either multiple 50s or a combination 37 and 50, the M15 combination gun motor carriage. Flak crews often would try to position themselves towards the flanks of the panzer units, as an enemy aircraft often would approach a flank and then turn in parallel to the front line in order to line up at as many targets as possible. With a large caliber gun thus, you could not only shoot at aircraft on the way in, but also during the attack run. With caliber 50, it's much more of a point defense weapon. If you got within range of an M16, you're in for the significant emotional event, but the M16 couldn't reach out as far. There were quite a few M15s built as well, but they were not as prevalent as the German 2 centimeter and 3.7 centimeter cannons. There are of course exceptions to everything. The 1-ton Leichter Personenkraftwagen was basically a truck with an MG34 twin mount, particularly for accompanying infantry units or Sturmgeschutzabteilung, but they went away mid-war as basically being ineffective against modern aircraft. As for weapons on the tank itself, it seems to have been a difference of opinion as to the best solution to being attacked. The goal of your air defense encounter is to survive, not to shoot down airplanes. I've actually got a video on that, and it's entitled "When Your Tank is Attacked by Aircraft." Both German documentation from the time and reports from Allied pilots indicated that when attacked, Germans would shoot absolutely every weapon they had to hand, from rifles to machine guns. However, most German tanks did not equip a pintle machine gun mount. Some certainly did, and it was specifically designated as a Flak MG, with the mount labeled in the manual as Fliegerbeschussgerät. To that extent, the machine gun mount is for the same purpose as the caliber 50 on an American tank, air defense. However, there very well may have been a difference of opinion as to the role of a tank commander when under attack. The reality was that aircraft generally were horrible at killing tanks, though P-47 or Typhoon advocates won't often admit it, and it was far safer to get into the tank and close the hatch than it was to do anything else. Indeed, one of the biggest problems that the German veteran crews had was getting their new green crewmen to not jump out of the tank when they saw an Allied Jabo lining up on them. But if so, then why fit any tanks at all with the pintle? Well, there is still merit to sending a bunch of tracer at an attacking aircraft. This is certainly the American philosophy for tank pintle-mounted air defense. However, we now encounter a German ammunition conservation philosophy of lohnende Ziele, which basically comes down to only shoot at targets that are worth the expenditure. If your object is to distract an incoming enemy pilot, the amount of lead which you would be putting up from 4 MG34s wouldn't have a commensuratively greater effect for the level of ammunition expenditure compared to that from shooting but a single MG34. You're probably not going to shoot the aircraft down either way, but even just the one machine gun ought to give the pilot something to think about as he's trying to line up, especially if there's a second stream of tracer coming in from ways away from a Harris flak 3.7 centimeter. Americans, of course, have traditionally had a more DACA approach to dealing with problems. Ammunition conservation doesn't really seem to have been a particular doctrinal philosophy. There are two additional touch points to look at. One is how anti-aircraft configuration of American tank destroyer battalions changed with the change in perceived air threats. The tank destroyer battalion came about after footage of all those Panzers and Stukas ruffle-stomping Britain and France came about. Every platoon of destroyers was to be accompanied by a section of anti-aircraft vehicles, specifically declared as requiring 37mm automatic cannons. These ended up becoming the M15 CGMC. However, the vehicles were dropped from the TD table of organization in late 1942, presumably after experience showed that the German air threat could be tamed by the US Army Air Forces and the RAF. So you didn't really need to have as many specific vehicles and crews dedicated to the anti-air role. But if an aircraft did come directly at you, the caliber 50 wouldn't take up much space and would at least make you feel a bit better about life. On the other hand, the Germans did start taking weapons from the Luftwaffe, who weren't shooting down many of the Allied Diablos. Note the use of the MG151 1.5cm and 2cm guns in the ground mount role, eventually being mounted on half tracks as a 251/21 drilling. A stupidly popular weapon, the German ground troops would have taken as many as they could get. Yet the 1.5cm was replaced by the 2cm when possible. They wanted larger. There was a third gun to consider in this as well, the MG131, a 13mm weapon and thus as close to a caliber 50 as possible. Though primarily an electrically primed aircraft gun, it could be converted to a ground mount and percussion fired. It could thus be mounted on a tank much like an American caliber 50, yet it never was. So why then would the Heer be willing to accept a Luftwaffe gun with a new ammunition type and resulting logistical complications in the form of the MG151 and not the MG131? One has to keep going back to questions of lethality and range, combined with lohnende Ziele. If the 131, which in fairness also had an unnecessary rate of fire for the role, wasn't much more likely to do more than distract incoming pilots than the 7.92mm MG34, then it was not necessary to mount it on the tank for point defense. On the other hand, if you want something which provides a lot of coverage and has a good chance of actually shooting down a target, especially an armored one like an IL-2, you're better off with a heavier gun on a dedicated platform with a trained, dedicated anti-aircraft crew. Again, this is my personal inference from what I can glean. I have not seen this answered in official documentation, and apparently neither has anybody else, but it's the best I can give you. Sorry. Feel free to expand on my line of thinking with any other inputs that you may have. Take care, and thanks for thinking of me.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. I really appreciate the input. It's fun to get perspectives from people who are subject matter experts in areas that I'm really not. So if you're interested in armored vehicles, their development from very early ones to quite modern ones, definitely check out Nick's channel. I will link to it in the description text below. And hopefully this did a fairly comprehensive job, I hope, of answering the question of why didn't the Germans have a version of the M2? So if you would like to have one of your questions answered in video format like this, head on over to Patreon or Utreon. You can sign up to help support Forgotten Weapons, and I have threads running on both of those platforms each month to get submissions for Q&A questions just like this one. Thanks for watching. Thanks for the excellent question, and I'll see you guys next time.